Hello, sociology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 9 Inequalities of Race and Ethnicity. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be race, the different classifications, some of the inequality issues, and such. So, when we talk about race, this is a category of people who are regarded as socially distinct because they share a genetically transmitted physical characteristic. The key here to remember is that there is no such thing as pure race because of our evolution and such. For the most part, we all contain kind of a very similar genetic code when we look at DNA. But over the years, sociologists have come up with three major anthropological classifications. The first one is Caucasoids. These are individuals with fair skin, have straight or wavy hair. The second classification is Mongoloids. These are individuals that have a darker pigmentation, maybe a yellowish pigmentation. Probably more importantly are the distinct folds around the eyes. And finally, the Negroid, which is a classification that is primarily based on the pigmentation of the skin being dark or their hair being coarse or very woolly or curly in nature. When we look at things like ethnicity, this refers to cultural features that can be handed down from one generation to the next through socialization. So, for the most part, ethnicity probably is a combination of things such as race, but it probably has more to rely on with culture. When we talk about ethnic groups, these are peoples whose physical appearance or cultural practices are unlike those of the dominant group, making them maybe more susceptible to different or unequal treatment. And so as we go along here, I want to take a look at the United States, again, kind of based by counties, and the ancestry based on that. And if you kind of look at Nebraska and you look over at maybe the key of our map here, you'll notice that pretty much the majority of the state is of probably a German ancestry. Okay, or at least that's the dominant group that comes up whenever people have been surveyed. If you look at Thurston County, because that is where we have the Omaha Nation and the Winnebago Nations, you can see that the Native Americans make up the vast majority of the people that live in those counties. Otherwise, if you look at other parts of the United States, I think it's kind of interesting when you look at states like Kentucky and Tennessee, the vast majority of people identify themselves as being Americans, opposed to looking at European ancestry as a way to kind of determine where they came from. When you talk about like the American Southwest, you'll see higher numbers of individuals who identify as being Hispanic or Latino, opposed to other parts of the country, particularly like the Northeast, where you might see people that have French or English heritage that they kind of rely upon. All right, moving on. When we look at the world and we kind of look at it maybe in terms of religion, this might also help identify people, as far as ethnicity. If you look at the United States, predominantly Protestant and Roman Catholic. If you look at parts of North Africa and into the Middle East, you'll notice that predominantly Islamic. If you're looking at areas of sub-Saharan Africa, that's Africa south of the Sahara Desert, you're going to find people who identify as a combination of tribal, Muslim, or Christian, and so forth. All right, moving on. Distinguishing features of minority groups. A minority group is identified by characteristics that are socially visible. Members of a minority group may suffer various disadvantages at the hands of another group, predominantly the people who are in the majority. A minority group is a self-conscious group with a strong sense of oneness. And number four, membership of a minority group is an ascribed status, meaning that you were born into it. And then finally, members of a minority group by choice or out of necessity typically marry within their own group. Okay, so as far as looking at marriage in terms of endogamy, meaning that people stay within that group, they have a tendency to do that opposed to marrying outside, which would be known as exogamy. All right, 6 patterns of intergroup hostility or cooperation. We're going to take a look, first of all, at 3 ways that groups kind of cooperate, and then at when we get through 4 and 5, and 6, we're going to talk about hostility as far as how people are involved. When we talk about assimilation, this is an idea of people over a period of time assimilating to the majority. Minority and majority differences are eliminated because minorities reassimilate or are absorbed into the dominant culture by taking on new cultural or physical characteristics. The second would be pluralism. This is the idea that in some societies, minorities maintain their distinctive cultural and physical traits, but they coexist with the dominant group. In terms of like how we look at the United States using assimilation and pluralism, there used to be this belief that the United States was a melting pot, which is kind of the idea of assimilation. But probably more often is the case is that the United States is probably more of a tossed salad, which is more of the pluralism way of looking at things, meaning that there are groups that maintain their identity as far as their physical characteristics or cultural beliefs and practices. Number 3, there are legal protections of minorities. Minorities are protected by law in some societies. That is definitely the case here in the United States. We might have majority rule, but we do have protection of minorities. And if you look at actions of the Supreme Court, they have a tendency to do that, even though you might have the vast majority of people saying they want a law to be maybe implemented a certain way. If the court sees it as being unfair, that they will side with the minorities to protect them. As far as hostility, you can have this idea of population transfer. Population transfer sometimes is known as like white flight, this idea that people are moving away from certain neighborhoods that are becoming populated with minorities and moving towards the suburbs. This situation of intense hostility between minority groups are removed when people move voluntarily or involuntarily to different communities or suburbs, if you want to call it that. And number 5, continuous subjugation. Subjugation is basically the historical um, mistreatment of certain groups of people. Okay, so when we talk about racism between whites and blacks here in the United States, that certainly falls into this category, but it's the majority group openly exercises its privilege at the expense of minority groups. And unfortunately, throughout our world, we have seen examples of this. And finally, the worst of the worst is this idea of extermination, the elimination of an entire racial, cultural, or ethnic population. And every so often we hear about these things. In the 1990s, we heard about ethnic cleansing in parts of Yugoslavia, or what used to be Yugoslavia. We have had that happen also in places like Rwanda. So it's not unheard of in the modern day and age, but it is unfortunate that it does occur. You would have thought that maybe over time we've kind of would have gotten smarter about these things, but unfortunately they do happen, and we need to be aware that they still do. Along the way, when we talk about racism, this is the belief that one racial or ethnic group is inferior to another and thus deserves unequal treatment. We've had racism issues in our country. When you talk about the Jim Crow laws and how those were implemented for generations, certainly that would fall into that. Prejudice or prejudice, this is an irrational or an inflexible attitude towards an entire category of people. When we look at like prejudice, this is kind of like, a way of thinking in a sense. When we look at discrimination, this is more of an action. This is actually the unequal treatment. Some of it is based on prejudice, but it is actually you're going beyond just thinking. You're actually purposely going out and treating people unfairly as a result of their group membership. All right, sources of prejudice. Stereotypes, these are rigid mental images that summarize whatever is believed to be atypical about a group. Authoritarian personalities, these are distinctive sets of traits centered on conformity, intolerance, or insecurity. So typically, if there's like somebody that an individual looks up to, their authoritarian personality, if that person is for the most part, saying things that are irrational and certainly unfair to others, um, people might follow that lead because of that personality type. And unfortunately, that's how sometimes prejudice gets perpetuated from one generation to the next. A parent that certainly holds those kind of attitudes, if they spout off about it to their kids, it's not going to be unheard of if the kids kind of follow the parents' lead. Irrationality, this is illogical and inconsistent. Prejudiced people aren't concerned about the genuine group characteristics, but they simply accept the negative statement that feeds into their existing hostility. Number 4, scapegoating. This is placing the blames for one's troubles on a relatively powerless person or group. And finally, the social environment, the source of prejudice mentioned thus far appears to be primarily psychological and includes thoughts and feelings that are developed and shaped by their social context. All right, thank you very much.